What on earth are you supposed to do when you are dealing with a Trump who's taking this kind of universal action? How much can you achieve when you are dealing with an emperor who has no clothes on, who's unreliable?
Trump wants to be the king. Unfortunately, you expect some level of wisdom from the king. As a result, I think we're all going to suffer from some very bad decisions that are being made in the United States.
This episode was brought to you by 91. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Readiness Report with the Daily Maverick. I'm glad to be with you. We're going to spend the next few minutes making sense of what's happening in the world. We are looking at how nations, leaders, and citizens can cope with the unpredictable world. This is perhaps Donald Trump's favorite day, although I don't think he even understands the kind of disruption that he has caused. He has a very triumphant type of attitude. Why? Because, of course, between now and I think the other countries have August 7th as the deadline for the US to enforce new tariffs ranging from 25% to 50% on exports from key countries. The highest rates, of course, I'm sure you've been hearing it, target countries like Brazil at 50%, Canada 35%, Switzerland 39%, South Africa 30%, India and Japan, South Korea 25%, and Taiwan 20%. Some of the nations have avoided that kind of top tier tariffs via their last minute deals, bilateral relations, and while dozens others are bracing for what is to come next. I just want to say two things that really reflect the psychology of the man. So here's this whole disruption, the tariffs, which are going to have a consequential impact on economy, on the global economy, on trade, and so on. And any sober person will analyze them as an important geopolitical turning point. But just to show what goes on or doesn't go on in Trump's mind, he's using them also as a personal whip to settle scores with nations that he doesn't agree with. Canada stated that it will recognize the state of Palestine. I think there were conditions to that as well, just like the UK. And he threatened tariffs if Canada were to do. It's insane. And then in Brazil, Bolsonaro is facing charges of corruption and God knows what, based on his time and tenure as the president of Brazil. And this has nothing to do with the United States. But because Trump and Bolsonaro kind of share this kind of strongman politics, they are anti-science, they are crass and gung-ho in the way that they deal with politics. They are unconventional, a bit also vulgar, if you ask me. So that's his buddy. That's a kind of person who turns Trump on. But Brazil is now not allowed to prosecute a former president accused of wrongdoing. And if they were to do, Trump is threatening tariffs. Think about it this way. In South Africa, we have a former president who has spent the last 20 years of his life, certainly the latter part, the last few years since he was recalled, in and out of court, subverting one rule after another just to delay his trial on corruption charges. So imagine if that trial is now interrupted because Trump is friends with Zuma and is not allowing South Africa's processes, South Africa's constitution, South Africa's court to deal with the matter. We've had so many scandals, the Gupta Gate and Kandla Gate, all of that. So what he's essentially saying is that we can't use our constitution as a country to prosecute those whom we want to prosecute if they are his friends. So you get a sense that we are talking with this big matter, tariffs. It's got implications on multilateralism and trade and the economy and all of that. But here's Trump just trivializing things of enormous significance because he doesn't like what each country is doing. Anyway, that's just in a nutshell. But let's just talk about South Africa today on the 1st of August. And who better than my buddy, Phillip van Niekerk. Hello, darling.
Hello, Redi. Good morning.
Good morning. So I'm sure you also woke up to so many interview requests, people at home wanting to understand what is going on in agriculture, the manufacturing industry, the citrus farmers, what is going on. In a nutshell, what is the political and economic calculus here? What is happening today?
I think on the global stage, what is happening is chaos, because a country that represents 1/4 of the global consumer market has declared economic war on virtually the entire rest of the world. I think in South Africa, we're too focused on August 1 as being the date when everything happens and we fall off the edge of the world. There are still, I think, first of all, we're not alone in terms of how the United States is going to be charging us. But second of all, this, in Trump's mind anyway, and in the way this works, there's still an ongoing negotiation. So it's not the end of the road. I think what it has been is this sort of wake-up call for South Africa that we need to diversify our trading relationships. And I think that's true of a lot of the rest of the world. But of course, not everybody can move away from the United States, given the United States, as I said, is a quarter of the world's economy. Yeah, and in fact, most of the deficit countries are in the other 75%, mainly China and Germany and countries like that. So it's not going to be easy, but it's incredibly rocky. One thing I would say is that for the United States, this is going to damage us in South Africa. It's going to cost thousands of jobs. There's no question. This is a very harmful thing. I don't think we're especially singled out on the tariffs, but I do think that the American economy is what's going to suffer the most. This is actually involved in an act of self-harm against his own country. And I think we're seeing this morning, I just seen the jobs report just came out a few minutes ago. They've revised downward the last couple of months to almost zero. This month came in at 73,000 jobs created, way below expectations. So we're seeing a very anemic American economy moving into potential recession at the same time as inflation remains steady and too high for the Fed to think about lowering interest rates. All in all, the biggest damage is going to be inflicted on the American economy. But for us in South Africa, this is not a good moment. I particularly think of the motor car industry in the Eastern Cape. I think is going to be very hard pressed to match these tariffs. And I think the agricultural guys have probably got a better thing going. But I do understand that there's still an ongoing trade negotiation. And I have hope that we might actually, at the end of the day, come out with something that is at least livable and reasonable for the moment, that is not, as I said, the end of the world.
Yeah, I think that's very important, the kind of universality of it all. And I saw how Ursula von der Leyen was criticized. The EU was criticized, commentators saying, you've just thrown our countries under the bus. Trump is going to impose tariffs and in return, we do nothing. So in different types of regions, these tariffs are obviously causing a very negative disruption, and countries continue to negotiate with Trump and so on. But I think the perspective is important, that of course we're going to suffer. We mustn't trivialize this, but there is a domestic impact as well. There's an impact on the United States as well. Tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods. When they impose, the cost of the imports rises, and so on. Consumers, businesses are also going to pay more for these affected goods. But then the question is, if tariffs are so harmful to the American economy as well, why is Trump doing it? Why does he think there are gains to this? Can we get into his mind for a second?
He's been fixated on tariffs for a long time. And I hate to say this, but he fundamentally doesn't understand, how economies work. He thinks that trade is a zero-sum game. That if somebody is buying something from somebody else, then the person who's buying it, and therefore is in a deficit, is basically giving that money to the other person for nothing. The point is that if you're going to have a trading relationship with another country, the issue is, that you both want to benefit from it. Trade is actually a win-win. Overall, you have some countries have competitive advantages in some things, and other countries have competitive advantages in others. In an ideal world, you would have a trading market in which there are no deficits and surpluses simply because it all balances out. But that's not the world that we're living in. And Trump's right about that global trade has got very unbalanced, and the United States probably does have too large a deficit. And in many ways, I think China has too large a surplus, has $1 trillion surplus with the rest of the world. And at some point, other people are going to be basically supporting the lack of demand that China's been not able to create in their own economy. But at the end of the day, Trump really doesn't understand. He has a fixed idea, that these tariffs are going to some other bring in massive amounts of revenue. They're going to restore manufacturing to the United States. They're going to basically, and he's doing it by mafia tactics, extortion, and in a way that has created enormous uncertainty in the global economy, because it's not even that he comes out one day and he says, all right, these are the tariffs. He comes out and he says, these are the tariffs, and then he changes his mind and the date changes, and then somebody does something he doesn't like, and he pushes up the tariffs. And at the end of the day, it's not even legal, potentially, in the United States. This thing is going all the way to the Supreme Court, because the power of tariffs really resides with Congress, for a start. And secondly, he's using emergency powers to raise these tariffs. And nobody can really legitimately argue that having a trade deficit means that your country is in a national security emergency. And that's essentially what he's saying.
And with Europe in particular, hey, Philip, you've just reminded me of something. I forgot that national security element. Europe was stunned when the US imposed tariffs on steel and aluminium, citing national security. And I remember thinking at that time, national security against allies, that makes zero sense.
He uses whatever crazy legal argument he can to essentially do what he wants to do, which is behave like a king. Yeah, you have one man sitting in this big world of billions and billions of people making decisions that affect a lot of people's livelihoods, a lot of people's jobs. And that's the Trump psychology. Trump wants to be the king. Trump wants to, unfortunately, you expect some level of wisdom from the king. And we're not getting a lot of wisdom here. And as a result, I think we're all going to suffer from some very bad decisions that are being made in the United States. And there's a kind of group of people around Trump who are such sycophants and acolytes that they can't tell him, that the emperor has no clothes. This is bullshit. This is not the way that you resolve whatever economic problems the United States has.
I want to talk a little bit about South Africa, because at home, the coverage has been that South Africa dropped the ball. There's a lot to criticize about South Africa's trade policies, the way we communicate, foreign policy. You can find a whole lot of things to critique, but what on earth are you supposed to do when you are dealing with a Trump who's taking this kind of universal action, not just directed at South Africa? The reasons he advances change depending on which country, but in terms of retaliatory reciprocal tariffs, this is a universal response from him, but also the space for rational debate. How are you going to be banging your head against the wall, hoping to get through to Trump? And the next day he says this, and the next day he says that. I understand that DIRCO Minister Ronald Lamola is in town, not DC, but another town in the United States. I won't say much about that, but we heard from Pakistau. Trade and Industry Minister spoke to Talk Radio 702 and confirmed that there have been ongoing engagements and communications. Zane Dango, the DG at Treasury at DIRCO, was also quoted. So it doesn't matter where they are geographically or on which day they spoke. Clearly, some maneuvering, some communication is happening. But how much can you achieve out of that when you are dealing with an emperor who has no clothes on, who's unreliable? And just to finalize this point, I just want to read what he posted on his social media platform, just to demonstrate the unpredictability of Trump and how capricious he is, and he just changes his mind. Yesterday, he lashed out at India, and India has been groveling to Trump and the United States. Despite that, he lashed out at India. And remember, when he came into office, he thought he and Vladimir Putin were going to be buddies, and he knows how to get through to Putin. EU doesn't know how to get through to him. But look where they are now. He says, I don't care what India does with Russia. They can take their dead economies down together for all I care. We have done very little business with India. Their tariffs are too high, among the highest in the world. Likewise, Russia and the USA do almost no business together. Let's keep it that way and tell Medvedev, the failed former president of Russia, he's unhinged, who thinks he's still president, to watch his words. He's entering very dangerous territory. It's insane. How do you talk to someone like that?
Yeah, I think that's a problem. And when you've got 90 countries needing to negotiate new trade agreements and having deadlines and numbers change constantly, South Africa just struggles to get into the queue. And even the agreements that have been made end up being frameworks of agreement. And it's not even certain. Nobody has seen the text of these agreements that get announced at press conferences. South Africa does have a problem in the United States, but I think on the trade issue and as regards to tariffs, I think a lot of domestic criticism of the government has been misplaced. I don't think that with the best will of the world, if they'd appointed one of these right-wing Afrikaners as the special envoy or as an ambassador, somebody who has friends in the White House, that we would have got any better than the 30%. And we could wake up tomorrow morning and have had a bad dream about South Africa and put it up to 50%.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, by the way, the other thing that's happening is manipulation of markets. Because he knows in advance he's going to make some statement of that tariffs is going to jolt the market, it's going to send the markets down. And then you warn your friends, your billionaire friends, who go and place bets on what Trump's going to say. So this is not a good way to conduct economic policy. It's not a good way to conduct economic relations. So I don't blame South Africa in this instance. I do think South Africa has failed over the years, and this didn't start in the last couple of months, to put its case effectively in Washington, to build the relationships that it requires in Washington. And the thing that does worry me is that we're moving into a position where people in Washington start to believe that South Africa is a rogue state. And that's at Congress. That's not at the level of the trade negotiations. It's the level of this constant propaganda that South Africa is an ally of Iran and Hamas, and misconceiving the solidarity that many South Africans feel with the Palestinians, to equate that with the support for terrorism or for...
The problem with that is that a lot of that is coming from home. It's coming from rogue players at home. And I think we can say now, even the special envoy speaking at the JSE, he talked about this kind of imperialism, and he specifically mentioned a cabal of business leaders who have been behind that. And I'm surprised that South African media is fast asleep after making such a big deal of his comments from 2020 after Trump lost the election. And the main issue is what he hinted at, that there are people at home who are working against the interests of South Africa. And I'm just surprised that it's nap time thereby in the newsrooms, because if I were an editor, I would be assigning a journalist to find out who's he talking to, who are these leaders, what positions do they have, what proximity do they have to decision making, have they come to Washington to harm us, that kind of thing. But that's not what we're talking about now. Let's just look at the industries that are going to be affected in South Africa almost immediately or in the short term. And then I just want to take a geopolitical perspective on this to talk about how China responded previously, how the centerpiece of Trump's tariff agenda was thought to be China, but it's gone further. And China did not respond with just retaliatory tariffs. They came in with greater investment in Africa. And I read an analysis that said the message was clear from China. It was, if America was weaponizing trade, then China was going to globalize it on its own terms. But that's a topic for the next segment. Let's just talk about how South Africa is going to be affected in the immediate term and what are the alternatives. Look to other markets, but perhaps they're not big enough to replace what we stand to lose with the United States.
Change is daunting, challenging, disorientating, unstoppable. Change is inevitable. Change is wise. Change is action. It's liberating, rewarding. Change is brave. Change is opportunity. We're always ready to invest in it. 91. Investing for a world of change.
Well, look, our agricultural sector is very strong and actually can even sustain some fairly high tariffs coming into the United States. And at the same time, as I said, it's a wake-up call to go and find other markets. Find other markets in Africa, find other markets in Europe, find other markets in the Gulf states, find other markets in Asia. That's where we should be engaging. The whole of the rest of the world is looking at other partners and saying, how can we reorder our relationships so that we think differently about how we trade with each other outside of the United States? As regards agriculture, I can see that. I think it's the Eastern Cape and the motor industry that is going to be the hardest hit by this. And I think, there has to be a fundamental rethink. Because as it is, we subsidize the motor industry. I think it's like something 6 billion rand a year or whatever, to keep those plants going, in order to keep that AGOA, to keep that the Mercedes and so on, cars coming into the American market. And I think that's anyway under threat because of the EV revolution that's happening around the world. And maybe there's room to change, to retool those factories. China's got a little car, a BYT, that costs $10,000, electric vehicle. Why not turn those plants into be manufacturing and then sell them all the way up Africa. Of course, that has to go with other infrastructure. You've got to build charging stations, and you've got to rethink what your energy is in your economy. But there are ways and ways of dealing with it. It's not the end. Again, as I said, it's not the end of the world. I think it's going to hit. The Eastern Cape is already fairly depressed economically, and this doesn't come at a good time for the Eastern Cape. But hopefully, those in government are thinking creatively about how to turn this into something different and no longer be in a position where the United States can, at a whim, destroy the economy of an entire region because, why? Because somebody wrote something down on a piece of paper, 30%. Where did that come from anyway? So I think that's the main thing. I think it should be forcing South Africa to rethink, think differently, think creatively, find new relationships in the world. And we have a lot to offer. And let's build on our strengths, and let's work together as a country. And again, to come back to the point that we made earlier, let's think in the national interest. It is horrendous that it's South Africans who've come to Washington and found constituencies that are favorable to them to put pressure back home to get policies accepted and bring in the big bully boy, big brother, United States to get things sorted for them. And look at what they've done.
Exactly.
Look at the deficit
and that's
they've
something
created.
that South Africans resent. Even the fiercest critics of the ANC. I certainly identify as one person who's been a very fierce critic of the ANC. But
Me
the
too.
idea of reaching outside of South Africa for influence on domestic policy is just outrageous to me.
Yeah, and I think it's been, as I said, it's been incredibly damaging to South Africa because it's empowered those malign forces in Washington who don't like South Africa for whatever reason, because of support for the Palestinians or because of Black economic empowerment they relate to as being like DEI or whatever. And it's completely subverted the concept that South Africa is a democracy. South Africa has courts, independent courts, an independent media, a public debate. It's not always a great public debate, but we are a democracy.
And also you must win elections if you want. Okay, we are in a government of national unity, and I do think that there's a lot to criticize there. Though it's the first time that we are, in 1994, there was a government of national unity with F.W. de Klerk as second deputy and so on. Your roof mayors were in cabinet and so on. But it's really the first significant time post this kind of fractured political system in South Africa. And it's not time to go seek outside help to solve policy differences. And one could say then win elections decisively, then you can govern the way that you want. You can't just come run to the United States every time you're unhappy with our land restitution process, with our education system, with transformation policies. You fight within and you influence and persuade voters that your policies are policies for the future. You don't run to any other country to come and interfere after you failed to win decisively an election that was held just a year ago. But I do want to talk about this kind of where we find ourselves in this fractured trade system. Okay, we're supposed to go looking out for new markets, new partners, and new leverage. Everybody is doing that. Countries in the global south, though, even as they instinctively reject or are hedging against US dominance, you don't want to replace that with another type of dominance, Chinese dominance, for example. And I said earlier that China's response to these tariffs has been praised in some quarters as being very strategic, that it didn't respond with just retaliatory tariffs, but with greater investment in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. So you don't replace one source of dominance with the other. What does all of this mean just in terms of a multipolarity and China's engagement with Africa and its role as I don't want to use the word superpower, because if we're saying we're dismantling all of that, but in this context, its role as a powerful force in the global south that others will follow?
Obviously, we would not want to replace one hegemon, I think is the word we look for, with another hegemon. But I think it's complicated how the other powers are engaging with Africa, including China, because you've got to remember, Africa suffered from the first China shock. When China became the kind of center of global manufacturing, it wiped out a lot of industry in Africa. Northern Nigeria, the textile mills closed down. Even in South Africa, we lost the textile industry in the Western Cape very much. But we were able to sell commodities. Our raw materials went into that massive process in which China was being built up. That's between 2000 and 2015. And that pushed up the living standards generally in Africa. Now China has an issue, which is that, as I said, they've got $1 trillion deficit, surplus for the rest of the world. So China is like pushing out these electric vehicles, they're pushing out solar panels, they're doing all these amazing things technologically. But at the end of the day, it's become very unbalanced. And part of the problem with that unbalance is that China itself needs to grow its domestic demand so it's got an oversupply that's pushing into the global markets. So where's the space for African manufacturing other than commodities to actually sell into the Chinese market? And I think that's the challenge to figure out, because, where the United States has always been an important anchor in the global economy is this enormous consumer market, which in many ways raised South Korea, raised Japan, Taiwan. The Asian tigers actually were built up on that, being able to export into the United States market. The other thing is that the big investors in Africa, I think in the last couple of years, are the Gulf states. It's Qatar and the United Arab Emirates and Turkey, which is not a Gulf state, but is part of that general region. And so I think what we're going to see geopolitically in terms of where do we reorient ourselves, it's not like West versus East so much as looking to that region, which is very much closer to Africa in many ways, as also being the kind of one of the regions that's going to really start to take off. And it obviously serves our interests to have a multiplicity of relationships, because we are entering a world where there are going to be very many different kind of relationships to have. And I think South Africa needs to develop that, because that is our strength. We are the largest trading partner of the United States, the largest trading partner of Europe in Africa, the largest trading partner of India, the largest trading partner of China. So we already have that outward looking position in the world. And I think that's something that we can really benefit from. And I do think there's a lot of thinking going on in that regard.
Okay, so this geopolitical chess game, will Africa be a player or just the terrain on which others play? We have some tools, some cards to play, but these are really difficult times. And I think it's very clear that these tariffs are not just about trade deficits. Trump is just signaling something. Some of this it's not well thought out. So we just fasten our seatbelt and see where we go next. Phillip, always a pleasure talking to you on the Readiness Report.
Thanks, Redi.
Thank you. That's the Readiness Report, folks, with the Daily Maverick. And of course, we are very happy that this episode and those coming next brought to you by Investment Managers 91.